So I got involved in this research after Superstorm Sandy struck, and I was at the National Ocean Service at NOAA. And I think Superstorm Sandy was actually a key turning point in the way the federal government is thinking about coastal resilience. And so prior to Superstorm Sandy, when we talked about coastal resilience, it was almost entirely about gray or built infrastructure like seawalls and riprap, levees and dikes. And after Superstorm Sandy, the conversation shifted not away from gray and built infrastructure, because we will always have a need for some of that, but to include, the conversation broadened to include natural infrastructure. And when I talk about natural infrastructure, what I mean are things like salt marshes and mangroves, coral and oyster reefs, beaches, dunes, and barrier islands, and seagrasses as well. So I was tasked by leadership within the National Ocean Service to help figure out what was the state of the science, the state of our knowledge on how natural ecosystems provide coastal protection. And so that resulted in a publication. And there are many factors that actually influence how much coastal protection you get from natural ecosystems. The first of it is what size the ecosystem is and how continuous that ecosystem is. In a natural state, or has it been cut up and divided, for example, by roads or train tracks or by oil and gas pipelines, for example. So the continuity and the area of habitat is really important. If it is a vegetated ecosystem, the density of that vegetation is very important for how much wave energy reduction you're going to see. And then if it's a reef ecosystem, the reef crest, the front edge of that reef, the height of that reef crest is really important, because that's where a lot of the wave energy dissipates as it goes over that reef crest. So let's think about what I mean when I say natural infrastructure. Here's an example. Here's a community that might have had some flooding after the last big storm and says, we want to invest in natural infrastructure. What might that look like? Well, for this community here, it might be about the fact that they might have some salt marsh that they decide they're going to protect. And then they might be remembering that they used to have really abundant oyster beds and an oyster reef, but that disappeared when water quality got bad. And so maybe they're thinking about restoring the oyster beds and the oyster reef. Maybe they're thinking about repairing the barrier island that got breached during the last storm. So those are the kinds of opportunities you could be thinking about with natural infrastructure. And what's really neat with natural infrastructure is you don't need to pick just one of these. You can layer these approaches, and every single piece that you do in terms of restoration or protection will have added benefit. So some of the other benefits we get from natural infrastructure include that these systems can actually strengthen with time. This is particularly true for a restored system, which is weakest the day you say that the restoration is complete, and then it grows stronger with time as that system establishes. These can be self-maintaining, and they have the potential for self-repair after storms. None of these things can be said for built infrastructure. These systems can also grow and keep pace with sea level rise in some cases, and they can be more cost effective. And I have a little bit more about that coming up, but they provide the most important thing I think to also consider with these systems, in addition to all these coastal resilience benefits, is that they provide all sorts of other co-benefits, and they're providing those benefits all the time. Whereas built infrastructure for storm protection is only usually providing that storm protection benefit, which is only important when a storm is approaching. So what do I mean by these other benefits? Additional benefits you might get from these coastal systems include fisheries support for recreational and commercial fisheries, carbon storage, particularly in the case of coastal wetlands, recreation and tourism, water filtration, so water quality improvements, cultural services, and habitat for other species we care about. All right, I want to move on to coastal blue carbon. So let's start first with thinking, just getting everyone on the same page about the different colors of carbon. So you may have heard of green carbon, which is the carbon taken up and stored by terrestrial plants. Black carbon is the carbon that comes from the production and use of fossil fuels, and also from fires on the landscape. And then we have blue carbon, which you may or may not have heard of. Blue carbon is the carbon taken up and stored by our coasts and our oceans. And what I'm going to focus on today is the coastal blue carbon. So this is the carbon taken up and stored by marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses. So it's that coastal component. It wasn't until about a decade ago that we actually started to compare the carbon stored in these systems to the carbon stored in what we think of as our more traditional carbon sinks, which are forests. And so I want to point out here, this is the carbon burial rate in soils. So we're comparing what's in soils, and you've got on the left, 3 different kinds of forested ecosystems, and then on the right, marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses. And note the logarithmic scale on the y-axis. So what you find is that in terms of carbon burial in soils, these systems are more than 10 times as effective. And so even though they represent a smaller total area of the planet, because of their greater sequestration rate, they are actually on the same order of magnitude as forests in terms of being an important natural carbon sink. So one of the things that I like to use as a metaphor when thinking about carbon is it's sort of like a bank account. We have a bank account for carbon. And so if this represents your annual income into your carbon bank account, this is what's getting put into the system each year, into the soil, then the other thing that matters when you're thinking about a bank account is what's already there, what's in savings, essentially. And that's what we're looking at here, which is not only do they sequester a lot of carbon per year, but they store carbon for very long periods of time. And so what you're seeing in this graphic, again, so on the y-axis now, we have our different ecosystems with a tropical forest at the bottom and then our wetland ecosystems at the top. The brown part of the bar is what's stored in soil, and the green part of the bar is what's stored in living biomass. And so what you see along the x-axis here is how much carbon is stored in the top meter of soil and then in the biomass in tons of carbon equivalents per hectare. So the first thing I want you to take away from this image is that the wetland ecosystems have far more carbon, or approximately the same amount of carbon, as a hectare of tropical forest. And so this is the kind of information that's been critical for expanding the discussion of our natural climate solutions to include coastal wetlands. Now, I want you to also look carefully at the brown part of these bars. What you see is that the majority of the carbon in these wetland ecosystems is underground. And so it's where we can't see it. Whereas in the tropical forest, the majority of the carbon is in the living biomass. It's in the green part of the bar, right? And so I think that is part of the reason why we weren't thinking about or talking about coastal wetlands as important natural sinks for carbon until more recently, because we can't see the carbon in the same way we can see it in a tropical forest. But the last thing I'm going to say about this graph is this is the carbon stored in the top meter of soil. For many of these coastal wetland systems, they are 2, 3, even 5 or 6 meters deep. Here in the Chesapeake Bay, several of the marshes that have been mapped all the way down to hard rock are over 5 meters deep. So this is a very conservative estimate of the amount of carbon stored in these systems when it's only the top meter of soil. So probably these wetlands are even bigger sinks than what this figure is showing. So again, this is what's in our savings account. This is what's already stored in those systems, in our carbon bank, if you will. All right, so how do these systems do this? Why are they such important sinks for CO2? Well, so it turns out that mangroves and salt marshes are some of the most productive ecosystems on the planet. These plants are phenomenal at taking up CO2 and producing biomass. And so a fraction of that biomass then makes its way into the soil, where it can then stay put. Now, why does it stay put in the soil in these systems? Well, these systems are tidally influenced and are basically wet most of the time, either covered in actual tidal water or having recently been covered in tidal water. And so they are very wet soils, which tend to be anaerobic, meaning there's not a lot of oxygen or no oxygen present. So what you do in these systems is have very productive plants that pump some of that carbon below ground into an anaerobic environment where decomposition slows way down. So it's really the perfect setup for pumping carbon below ground into a place where it's then going to stay. So protecting blue carbon means protecting the entire ecosystem, right? You cannot have these soils functioning properly and these plant communities functioning properly if you don't protect the whole ecosystem. And when we protect the whole ecosystem, we get a whole host of other co-benefits, which is super exciting, like recreation and really important habitat, and the coastal resilience benefit I mentioned earlier. And so I really see coastal blue carbon as this triple win, because you get mitigation, you get adaptation, and you get conservation when you are working on coastal blue carbon. One caveat I will make to that, and this is where my biogeochemistry background comes in handy, and it's just really cool science. But so when you have a saltier environment, basically full on salty salt marsh or brackish marshes that have saline content that's usually around 18 parts per thousand or higher, you have enough sulfate present in that water that in terms of anaerobic decomposition processes, the sulfate reducing bacteria will actually outcompete the methane producing bacteria. And so when you have a saltier system, you tend to have very low or no methane production. What that means in terms of carbon accounting is that carbon into these soils tends to be carbon staying in soils. There might be a small amount of decomposition occurring, but otherwise it's mostly occurring through pathways that don't generate greenhouse gases. As you get fresher and there isn't the sulfate present, what you get is methane production in these systems. And that's a natural process. There is nothing wrong with that. However, methane is a greenhouse gas, and it is much stronger than carbon dioxide. So if you are seeking carbon credits, for example, for a project, and it's a freshwater system, you will definitely have to monitor the methane emissions as well as what's being stored in the soil. And the other thing we really need to be thinking about, we people in our land use planning in our coastal areas, is how do we allow for the movement inland of these systems? Because that's how these systems have always survived through time. They move in and out as sea level rise, sea levels have risen and fallen in the past. And so the problem, of course, is where we have a road, a railroad, or other infrastructure, a community, a seawall. Those kinds of things will make it very hard for a wetland to move inland with sea level rise. And it's what's called coastal squeeze. And where possible, we need to be removing barriers, or in the case of, there's a really interesting paper by Enright et al. That came out in Frontiers in Ecology and Environment a few years ago. They looked all along the Gulf of Mexico, and they did look at places that are all there where there's already barriers, thinking that we could be potentially removing some of those barriers. But possibly even more low-hanging fruit is where there are communities that have planned development in the next 100 years, because you often have communities that have plans that are already out to 2100. Where they have already planned to do development in areas that otherwise we can model and know that with sea level rise are likely to be potential wetland inland migration routes. We should really be considering that land use planning and rethinking it now before anything even goes into place, because that will be the cheapest way of doing this, right? Don't build in those wetland migration corridors. Build someplace else that's not going to affect the ability of our coastal wetlands to migrate inland. And then we will actually be preserving future coastal wetlands with our land use decisions right now. And I think that's an incredibly important point. We're preserving what is currently upland for future coastal wetlands. And if we don't do this, we stand to lose a lot more coastal wetlands than we otherwise have to due to sea level rise. So it's all about the decisions we're making right now in terms of land use.